Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we are journeying high into the clouds of the South American continent, to a realm where the earth meets the sky in a jagged spine of stone and ice. We are traveling to the heart of the Andes Mountains to walk alongside the ghosts and echoes of the Incan Empire. I want you to imagine the air up here. It is thin, incredibly crisp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp moss, crushed coca leaves, and the distant metallic chill of a glacier wind. As you settle in and let the weight of your day simply melt away into the mattress, allow my voice to guide you across ancient suspension bridges woven from golden grass, through terraced valleys, painted in vibrant shades of emerald, and into the sacred, quiet courtyards of Cusco. I find it truly fascinating how a civilization completely isolated from the rest of the globe, and lacking many of the technologies we assume are necessary for empire building, managed to conquer some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. When I reflect on this moment in history, it strikes me that human ingenuity is not bound by the invention of the wheel, or by the forging of iron, or even by a written alphabet. The Inca had none of these things, yet they forged the largest empire ever seen in the pre-Columbian Americas. This simple, profound truth is our first gentle step into a world of 100 sleepy, mesmerizing facts about this mountain kingdom, woven together tonight like the threads of a beautiful Andean tapestry. Let us begin with the very earth beneath their feet. The Incan Empire, or Tawantinsuyu as they called it, stretched an astonishing 3,000 miles along the western coast of South America. To put that immense distance into perspective, it is roughly the same span as traveling from the northern tip of Scotland all the way down to the sun-baked coasts of Egypt. All of this vastness was connected not by horses or carts, but by the steady, rhythmic footfalls of human runners along a dizzying network of paved mountain roads. Think about the sheer physical endurance required just to exist in this empire. Much of their civilization thrived at altitudes exceeding 10,000 feet. Up here, the clouds do not just drift lazily above you. In the sky, they roll directly through the streets. They brush against your shoulders like cold, damp silk. The Inca people adapted so profoundly to this high-altitude existence that modern studies show their descendants still possess larger lung capacities and more red blood cells than those of us who live closer to the sea. It is almost as if the mountains themselves breathed their vastness directly into the biology of the people, expanding their chests to hold the thin, pure air. In the quiet heart of this empire sat Cusco, a city designed with a purpose so poetic it almost feels like a dream. If you were to soar above Cusco in the time of the great emperors, looking down through the parting mist, you would see that the entire capital was laid out in the shape of a giant puma. The puma was a highly sacred animal, a powerful creature representing the earthly realm in the Incan cosmology. The great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, sitting heavily on a high hill overlooking the valley, formed the jagged head of this massive stone cat. The city's main rivers were carefully channeled and straightened by engineers to form the creature's spine and tail. I always marvel at this level of mindful urban planning. They did not just build a city to live in, they sculpted a monument out of the earth itself, a physical prayer to the natural world they inhabited. As you lie there, listening in the dark, picture those massive stone blocks of the fortress. Some of them weigh over 100 tons, yet they were carved and fitted together so perfectly, so seamlessly, that even today, centuries later, you cannot slide a single blade of grass between them. This brings us to another beautiful truth about their silent world of stone. They did not use mortar, they did not use mud or cement to bind these colossal walls. Instead, they relied on a technique of precision cutting so exact that the sheer weight and friction held the stones together. But there is a deeper, more profound reason for this architectural choice, born from the restless nature of the Andes. This is a land of violent earthquakes, a land where the ground can suddenly shiver and roll like ocean waves. When a tremor strikes, the mortarless stones of Incan walls do not crack or shatter in rigid defiance. Instead, they dance. The stones actually bounce and shift slightly with the movement of the earth, riding the kinetic energy. And then, as the shaking subsides, they settle perfectly back into their original resting places. When I think about this, it feels like a beautiful metaphor for emotional resilience, instead of rigidly resisting the unpredictable forces of nature. The Inca learned to move with them, to yield just enough to survive the shock and then to fall effortlessly back into peace. It is a wonderful thought to carry into sleep, learning to let the mind flow with the turbulence of the day and settle softly back into stillness. Let us journey out from the city now, walking down one of the main arteries of their great road system. The stone path is quiet tonight. The only sound is the wind whispering through the stiff mountain grass and the occasional distant call of a bird slicing through the thin air. The Inca built over 25,000 miles of these roads. They carved steps directly into sheer cliff faces. They built massive retaining walls to hold back landslides, and they constructed floating bridges over raging, deep-cut rivers. These bridges were woven entirely by hand from braided grass. Imagine standing at the edge of a deep mountain gorge. Below you, the water churns violently in the shadows, and stretching across this terrifying void is a delicate-looking hammock of golden fibers. Yet these grass bridges were so incredibly strong that Spanish conquistadors would later ride their armored horses across them. Every single year, the local communities would gather, cut down the old weathered bridge, and weave a brand new one over the course of 3 days. It was a communal act of renewal, a physical tying together of the people across the divide. I love this idea of continuous, purposeful maintenance. Nothing was meant to last forever without the gentle care and attention of human hands. As we walk along this path, the shadows grow long, painting the terraced mountainsides in deep purples and indigos. These agricultural terraces are another marvel of this world, looking like giant green staircases, climbing endlessly up to the heavens. The Inca did not have flat farmland, so they carved it out of the mountains themselves. But these terraces were not just for planting potatoes and corn. They were sophisticated microclimate engines. The heavy stone walls of the terraces absorbed the blazing heat of the sun during the harsh, bright days. Then, as the freezing Andean night descended, the stones slowly released that stored warmth, protecting the delicate roots of the crops from the killing frost. It was a gentle, brilliant way of hugging the earth, of keeping the soil warm, while the stars blazed like ice in the dark sky above. It is easy to close your eyes and imagine the rich, dark smell of that warmed earth drifting up through the cold night air, promising sustenance and life in a place that seems so barren. While we are wandering through this tranquil, terraced landscape, a figure suddenly emerges from the mist, running at a steady, rhythmic pace. This is a Chasqui, a royal messenger. He blows a haunting, low note on a conch shell trumpet to announce his arrival at the next stone way station. These runners were trained from early youth to sprint great distances at high altitudes. They worked in relays, passing information and small items across the vast empire. Fresh fish from the Pacific Ocean could be delivered to the emperor high in the mountains in just a matter of days. It is a postal service that rivals many we have today, achieved entirely by the sheer willpower of human lungs and legs. But what truly captivates me is what this messenger carries in his hands. He does not hold a scroll of parchment or a clay tablet. He grasps a quipu. A quipu is a collection of brightly colored strings made from cotton or the soft wool of alpacas. Hanging from a main, thicker cord, down the length of these strings are series of intricate knots. The Incan Empire had no written alphabet, no hieroglyphs, no ink. Their entire history, their tax records, the stories of their gods, and the lineage of their kings were all recorded in the silent language of knots and threads. The position of the knot, the type of knot, the color of the string, and the way the fibers were twisted all held specific meanings. To read a quipu was to literally feel the history of your people slipping through your fingertips. I find it deeply moving that a society could hold its memory not in marks on a page, but in the soft, tactile weave of textiles, a profoundly intimate way of touching the past. Imagine sitting by a low, warm fire in a stone house, with a thatched roof made of that golden mountain grass. The wind is howling outside, but inside it is quiet, smelling of roasting maize and sweet wood smoke. Beside you, a village elder is reading a quipu by the flickering orange light. His rough, calloused fingers slide gently down the crimson and blue chords, translating the bumps and twists into a story of a distant valley. The llamas themselves are sleeping right outside the door, huddled together against the freezing cold. The llama was the absolute lifeblood of the Andes. They provided wool for warmth, and they were the only beasts of burden in the Americas. Yet, they are delicate creatures in their own way. They cannot carry heavy loads, and if you overload a llama, it will simply lie down on the ground, fold its legs under its body, and refuse to move. It is a stubbornness I think we can all respect when we feel overburdened by the demands of our own lives. The Inca understood this boundary, walking alongside these gentle animals, traversing the cloud forests in slow, deliberate caravans that moved only to the patient rhythm of the mountain itself. As these caravans moved through the high passes, the travelers were wrapped tightly in garments of astonishing beauty. You see, to the Inca, textiles were not merely clothing. They were the ultimate symbol of wealth, status, and identity. In our modern world, we often measure wealth in gold or silver, or in the digital numbers resting quietly in a bank account. But high in the Andes, the true measure of a person was woven from the soft underbelly fleece of the Vicuña. This delicate creature, a wild cousin of the llama and the alpaca, possesses a coat so incredibly fine and warm that it feels like touching a cloud. Only the Sapa Inca, the great emperor himself, and those he specifically favored were legally permitted to wear garments made of Vicuña wool. If a commoner was caught wearing it, the punishment was severe. It is a strange thought, isn't it? A world where the softness of your sweater could dictate your standing in the universe. But the artistry of these textiles went far beyond just the material. Women, and specifically a group known as the Aklas, or the Chosen Women, spent their entire lives perfecting the art of the loom. They wove geometric patterns called tokapu, which were so intricate and coded that some historians believe they functioned almost like a secondary written language alongside the Quipu. Each square of design could denote a person's profession, their family lineage, or their home province. When you looked at a high-ranking official walking through the plaza, you did not just see a man in a tunic. You read his entire life story draped across his shoulders. I always marvel at how visually rich their world must have been. Everywhere you looked, the clothing was speaking. Every thread held a secret, a quiet declaration of belonging in the vast tapestry of the empire. And while they prized cloth above almost everything, they were certainly not strangers to the allure of precious metals. But their relationship with gold and silver was entirely spiritual, devoid of the cold, hard capitalism that would later bring the empire down. To the Inca, gold was the sweat of Inti, the all-powerful sun god. It was a sacred substance that glowed with the eternal warmth of the sun itself. Silver, in turn, was the tears of Mama Killa, the moon goddess, reflecting her pale, gentle light across the dark Andean nights. Imagine walking into the heart of Cusco, making your way toward the Coricancha, the most sacred temple in the entire empire. Its name translates beautifully to the golden enclosure. As you step through its perfectly carved stone doorways, the breath catches in your throat. The walls of this courtyard were entirely plated in solid sheets of gold, but that was only the beginning. Inside this sacred space, the Inca artisans had crafted an entire life-sized garden out of precious metals. There were golden stalks of corn, with silver leaves and cobs shimmering in the sunlight. There were silver llamas grazing on fields of golden grass. Tiny, delicate golden insects rested on silver flowers. It was an earthly paradise frozen in eternal, blinding luminescence. I find it incredibly moving that they did not hoard this gold in dark vaults to count it as wealth. Instead, they molded it into the shapes of the natural world they so deeply revered, offering the sweat of the sun back to the sky in the form of a glittering, perfect garden. When the priests walked through this metallic garden, they would perform rituals aligned with the movements of the stars. The Inca were master astronomers constantly watching the heavens. But unlike many Western cultures that looked up and connected the bright dots of stars to form constellations, the Inca did something entirely unique. They looked at the dark spaces. High in the Andes, away from any light pollution, the Milky Way stretches across the night sky like a brilliant, diamond-dusted river. The Inca called it the Mayu, the celestial river. And within the dark, sprawling dust clouds that weave through the Milky Way, they saw the silhouettes of animals. They saw a dark llama with her baby, a toad, a fox, and a serpent, all drinking from the glowing river of stars. It changes your entire perspective, doesn't it? To look up into the endless night and find meaning not in the blazing points of light, but in the quiet, shadowed voids between them. As you drift closer to sleep tonight, try to imagine lying on your back on a soft bed of woven alpaca wool, feeling the gentle, cold mountain breeze on your face. Above you is an ocean of stars so dense you feel you could drown in it. But your eyes are drawn to the shadows. You trace the shape of the dark llama in the sky, watching over you as the earth turns slowly beneath your back, preparing to carry you deeper into the ancient mysteries of the mountains. As that celestial river of the Milky Way slowly rotates across the vast dark canvas of the Andean sky, the first faint hints of dawn begin to bleed over the jagged eastern horizon. The freezing night air, which just hours ago felt so sharp and absolute, begins to soften as a pale, bruised purple light touches the highest snow-capped peaks. Down in the valleys, the heavy mist that settled overnight looks like a thick ocean of spun sugar, trapping the cold in the deep crevices of the earth. But up on the high ridges, the world is waking to the approaching warmth of Inti, the sun god. There is a profound, almost sacred silence in these moments, just before the sun breaks over the mountains. The only sounds are the soft rustling of alpaca herds shifting in their stone corrals, and the faint, rhythmic crackle of small cooking fires being stoked to life inside the thatched roof homes. When I picture the daily lives of the Incan people, I am always drawn to their profound connection with the soil. They were an empire of brilliant engineers and fierce warriors. Yes, but at their very core, they were master agriculturalists. To survive and thrive in an environment where the altitude can freeze the blood and the steep slopes make traditional farming impossible, they had to understand the earth with an intimacy that is almost hard for us to grasp today. They did not conquer the land. They collaborated with it. This collaboration was rooted in a beautiful philosophy known as Aini, a concept of deep mutual reciprocity. If a family needed to harvest their fields, the entire village would come to help, with the absolute, unspoken understanding that when their own fields were ready, the favor would be returned. It was a society woven together, not by currency, but by the vital, shared exchange of human energy. Let us follow a group of farmers as they walk out into the crisp morning air, their breaths plumbing in white clouds before them. They wear warm, earth-toned ponchos and carry traditional tools, heavy wooden digging sticks with fire-hardened points, designed to pierce the tough mountain turf. Today, they are working in one of the most visually stunning and scientifically advanced locations in the ancient world. The circular terraces of Moray. Imagine standing at the edge of a massive, bowl-shaped depression in the earth. Instead of a natural valley, the Inca carved this massive sinkhole into a series of perfectly concentric, plunging, circular terraces. It looks like an enormous green amphitheater descending deep into the crust of the earth. From a distance, it appears almost like a giant, beautiful piece of land art, but its true purpose was far more practical and astonishing. Moray was, essentially, a grand agricultural laboratory. Because cold air naturally sinks and because the stone-retaining walls absorbed the sun's heat differently, depending on their depth and orientation, every single circular terrace created its own distinct microclimate. The temperature difference between the highest, widest terrace at the top and the smallest, deepest circle at the bottom could be as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. I find this level of ingenuity absolutely breathtaking. By simply carrying seeds down a few steps into this massive earthen bowl, an Incan farmer could simulate the climate of an entirely different region of the empire, from the humid jungles of the Amazon basin to the freezing alpine tundras, all within a single hillside. They used this site to experiment, crossbreeding crops and adapting plants to survive in the harshest conditions, ensuring that no matter what the unpredictable mountain weather did, the empire would never starve. And what were they growing in these meticulously engineered microclimates? The humble potato. But to call the Incan potato humble is to misunderstand it entirely. While we are used to perhaps 3 or 4 varieties in our modern grocery stores, the Inca cultivated over 4,000 distinct types of potatoes. There were potatoes shaped like twisted human fingers, potatoes that were bright violet, deep crimson, and mottled yellow. Some were so incredibly bitter they were toxic if eaten raw. But the Inca, through generations of patient observation, learned exactly how to process them. This brings us to one of their most remarkable inventions: freeze-drying. Yes, centuries before modern food preservation, the Inca were freeze-drying their harvests. They called it chuno. The process was both physically demanding and deeply in tune with the rhythm of the mountain weather. The farmers would take these bitter potatoes and lay them out on the freezing ground as the brutal night descended, allowing the intense frost to freeze the water inside the tubers. Then, as the blazing high-altitude sun rose the next day, the potatoes would thaw. The farmers, walking barefoot or in simple sandals, would gently but firmly trample the potatoes, using their body weight to squeeze the melting water out through the skins. They would repeat this cycle of freezing, thawing, and squeezing for several days until all the moisture was completely gone, leaving behind small, hard, chalk-white nuggets. This chuno was virtually weightless, incredibly easy for the runners and caravans to transport. And most importantly, it could be stored in massive stone storehouses for decades without ever spoiling. It was the ultimate insurance policy against famine. When I think of the sheer physical labor involved, the biting cold of the night, the blinding sun of the day, the rhythmic stepping of cold feet on freezing root vegetables. It paints such a vivid picture of human endurance and brilliance. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of a warm room, it is a comforting thought to remember those ancient hands and feet working in perfect harmony with the harshest elements of nature, simply to ensure that their people would always have enough to eat. And it was this incredible abundance of preserved food, these millions of freeze-dried potatoes and kernels of sweet maize, that filled the massive stone storehouses dotting the hillsides across the entire empire. These structures, known as kolkas, were quiet, architectural marvels of preservation. They were typically built round, constructed high up on the breezy, shaded slopes of the mountainsides. The Inca understood that the cool, constant mountain wind was nature's absolute finest refrigerator. They engineered the kolkas with specialized channels built into the stone floors and thatched roofs, allowing the crisp, freezing Andean air to circulate continuously around the stored food, preventing moisture and rot. Imagine looking up at the towering hills surrounding a major city and seeing hundreds, even thousands, of these neat stone cylinders standing like silent, peaceful guardians of the harvest. It is estimated by historians that, at the height of the empire, these high-altitude storehouses contained enough surplus food to feed the entire population for 3 to 7 years, even if every single crop in the valleys below miraculously failed. When I reflect on this immense, carefully guarded stockpile, it brings a deep sense of peace to my mind. In Tawantinsuyu's, widespread hunger was practically an unknown concept. The empire operated on a profound, highly organized system of social welfare. If you were too old to walk the steep terraces, too young to lift a digging stick, or too sick to work the fields, the state provided for you directly from these overflowing storehouses. There was a collective, unshakable responsibility to care for the vulnerable among them. It is a deeply comforting thought to drift off to tonight. This idea of a vast, powerful civilization whose greatest, most lasting achievement was perhaps not its glittering gold or its massive stone walls, but its absolute commitment to ensuring that not a single one of its people would go to sleep with an empty stomach in the cold dark. These vital kolkas were heavily concentrated near the Tampas. The thousands of stone waystations, spaced exactly a day's walk apart along the great Inca road system, the Capac Ñan. After a long, physically exhausting day of traveling over jagged peaks, through dizzying altitudes, and across swaying grass bridges, a weary traveler or a breathless runner would finally arrive at the welcoming wooden doors of a tampu. There, out of the freezing wind, they would find a roaring, warm fire, a safe place to rest their aching muscles on soft woven reed mats, and a hot, nourishing meal of quinoa stew and salted alpaca meat, all meticulously managed by local village administrators. Picture the warm, flickering orange firelight, illuminating the weary faces of travelers from all corners of the vast empire, sharing quiet, murmurings stories in the freezing night, entirely united by the immense, paved stone road that brought them together under one roof. As the travelers rest in the tampu and the Andean night deepens around them. Let us turn our attention to another soothing aspect of this mountain realm: the gentle, rhythmic sound of falling water. While the Inca undeniably mastered the heavy, unyielding nature of stone and earth, their relationship with water was pure, moving poetry. The sacred, terraced site of Tipon is perhaps the most beautiful surviving example of this. High on a steep mountainside, crystal clear, freezing natural springs bubble up from deep within the dark earth. The Incan engineers did not just brutally divert this water for farming, they celebrated its journey. They carved perfectly smooth, incredibly precise channels through the solid bedrock, guiding the pure snowmelt down a series of stunning, polished stone aqueducts and ceremonial fountains. The brilliance here is that the water does not just flow. It actually sings to you. The stonemasons specifically carved the angles of the stone drops and the width of the channels to create a beautiful, harmonious acoustic sound as the water cascaded gently from one green terrace down to the next. Listen closely in your quiet mind to that endless, soothing trickle echoing off the ancient masonry. It is the sound of life itself, carefully and lovingly guided by human hands, watering the sacred royal gardens and whispering ancient, liquid secrets to the cold stones in the dark. It is a mesmerizing, repetitive lullaby that the earth and the engineers composed together, playing endlessly on the side of a mountain for over 500 years. As that water eventually winds its way down into the sacred valley, it joins the great Urubamba River, carving a deep, winding, emerald path through the jagged Andes. If we follow this rushing river, venturing deeper into the cloud forest, where the air grows heavier and the vegetation explodes into 1,000 different shades of green, we arrive at the foot of an almost impossible mountain. High above us, hidden from the world below by perpetual, clinging mists and sheer, terrifying cliffs, lies the crowning jewel of Incan architecture. It is a place so perfectly integrated into its dramatic natural surroundings that it feels as though it was not built but simply grew out of the solid granite peak. We are climbing, slowly and quietly in the damp air, to the sanctuary of Machu Picchu. I want you to visualize the moment you finally breach the crest of the mountain after a long, exhausting climb. The thick, white clouds that have shrouded your journey suddenly part, dissolving into the warm morning light like smoke. And there it is, a city of grey stone resting gracefully on a saddle between two towering green peaks, surrounded by a dizzying abyss on 3 sides. When I look at the layout of Machu Picchu, it is impossible not to feel a profound sense of awe at the sheer audacity of its location. This was not a military fortress or a sprawling administrative center. It was a royal estate, a sacred retreat built for the Emperor Pachacuti. It was a place for the highest nobility to escape the biting cold of Cusco and commune directly with the mountain deities, the Apus. The stonework here reaches a level of perfection that almost defies logic. Imagine walking your hands along the walls of the Temple of the Sun, the only semicircular building in the entire city. The massive blocks of pale grey granite curve beautifully, following the natural, uneven contours of the bedrock beneath them. The Inca did not flatten the earth to build. They molded their stones to embrace it. This temple was meticulously aligned to frame the rising sun through a specific trapezoidal window on the exact morning of the winter solstice. Think about the incredible patience and astronomical knowledge required to achieve that. They observed the slow, subtle shifting of the sun's path across the sky for years, taking careful measurements without telescopes or modern instruments, just their eyes and a deep, reverent connection to the cosmos. And then they carved those observations into solid rock. As we wander deeper into the quiet, grassy plazas of this city in the clouds, we come across a highly polished, beautifully carved stone resting on a raised platform. This is the Intihuatana. The name translates to something incredibly poetic: the hitching post of the sun. The Inca believed that during the winter solstice, when the sun traveled furthest away from the earth, and the days grew frightfully short and cold, there was a real danger that Inti might simply continue walking across the sky and never return. It is a remarkably human fear, isn't it? The fear of the light leaving us in the dark. To prevent this, the priests would hold elaborate, deeply moving ceremonies at this exact stone. They would symbolically tie the sun to the Intihuatana, anchoring its golden warmth to the earth so that it could not wander too far away. They were tethering hope to the solid ground. I find it so beautifully comforting to imagine those ancient priests, draped in their fine Vicuña wool, chanting softly in the thin air, believing with their whole hearts that their actions were keeping the world alive and bathed in light. As you rest tonight, tethered to the comfort and safety of your own bed, you can let go of the day's worries, knowing that, just as the Inca trusted the sun to return, morning will always gently find its way back to you. The air up here at Machu Picchu is remarkably different from the dry cold of Cusco. We are at the very edge of the Amazon basin, and you can smell the rich, damp earth of the jungle mixing with the sharp, clean scent of the high-altitude orchids that cling to the ancient, terraced walls. These terraces, dropping steeply down the terrifying sides of the mountain, were once filled with hundreds of varieties of colorful flowers, medicinal herbs, and sweet maize, watered by a brilliant system of interconnected stone fountains that channeled the pure mountain rain directly through the heart of the city. Every drop was accounted for, every stone placed with intention. It is a masterpiece of harmony between human ambition and the overwhelming power of nature, resting silently in the clouds, waiting patiently for the stars to emerge once again. As those stars finally do emerge, piercing through the thin, high-altitude canopy of the night, the silver light of Mama Killa bathes the granite walls in a cold, ethereal glow. In the quiet dark, it is easy to feel the presence of those who walked these terraces centuries ago. For the Inca, the line between the living and the dead was wonderfully thin, almost translucent. When a great emperor or a beloved family member passed away, they did not simply disappear into the earth, forgotten and left behind. Instead, they were carefully preserved, transitioning into a new, deeply revered state of existence known as a molquai. The process of mummification in the dry, freezing air of the Andes was incredibly sophisticated. But the physical preservation was only a small part of the story. What is truly fascinating, and perhaps a little surprising to our modern sensibilities, is that these mulkeys were treated as though they were still entirely, vibrantly alive. It was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a deeply practical, daily reality for the royal households. The mummified emperors maintained ownership of their vast estates, their palaces, and their servants. They were dressed in the absolute finest Vicuña textiles. Their garments changed regularly, depending on the weather and the specific festivals happening in the city. Imagine walking into a softly lit stone courtyard in Cusco and seeing the preserved body of Pachacuti himself, sitting upright in a magnificent golden litter, being offered a highly decorated ceramic cup of chicha, a sweet, fermented corn beer. His royal descendants, a massive family group known as a panica, dedicated their entire lives to interpreting his will, caring for his lands, and even bringing him out to visit his friends. Yes, the Malquis would be carried gently through the streets to visit other mummified rulers. They would sit together in the great plazas under the open sky, observing the dancing, listening to the haunting music of bone flutes and rhythmic wooden drums, and silently participating in the grand, unending rhythm of the empire. When I reflect on this, I think there is something profoundly beautiful in this absolute refusal to let death sever the bonds of family and community. The past was never truly in the past. It was sitting right next to them, wrapped in a warm, brilliantly woven poncho, sharing a cup of corn beer in the afternoon sun. It is a comforting thought, this idea that we are never truly separated from those who came before us, that they are simply resting in a different form, still holding a place at the table. This deep reverence for the lingering spirit extended far beyond the preserved bodies of their ancestors. The Inca lived in a world where the landscape itself was completely alive, conscious, and watching. They called these sacred places and objects huacas. A huaca could be almost anything. It could be a massive, jagged boulder resting perfectly on a hillside, looking as if it had been placed there by giant, invisible hands. It could be a dark, quiet cave where a freezing spring bubbled unexpectedly to the surface. It could even be a strangely shaped potato found during the harvest, resembling an animal or a human face. Everything unusual, striking, or awe-inspiring was believed to contain a concentrated spark of divine energy, a pulse of the earth's own soul. When travelers walked along the great stone roads, their lungs burning in the thin air, they would often stop at specific huacas. Picture a weary traveler reaching the crest of a high, exhausting mountain pass. There, resting against the howling wind, is an apacheta, a large mound of small, smooth stones built over decades by thousands of passing hands. The traveler would pause, reach into their woven pouch, and gently place their own stone on the pile, or perhaps offer a few perfectly green, chewed coca leaves. It was a quiet thank you to the mountain for allowing them safe passage, a gentle payment of respect to the spirit of the peak. It was a constant, daily dialogue with the earth. They did not walk on the mountains, they walked with them. As you lie there listening, let your mind wander to the small, quiet things in your own life that hold a special energy or memory for you. A favorite worn-out book, a smooth pebble found on a distant beach on a perfect summer day, a photograph resting on your nightstand. In the Incan world, all of these things would be recognized as holding a beautiful, living spirit, a quiet companion keeping watch over you in the dark, tethering your heart to the ground, even as you drift off into sleep. And as you drift deeper into that peaceful state, wrapped in the quiet companionship of the world around you, it is fascinating to consider how this profound spiritual connection extended into their understanding of the human body itself. To the Inca, physical illness was rarely just a mechanical failure of the body. It was often viewed as a spiritual imbalance, a disruption in the delicate harmony between the individual, the community, and the watching earth. Because of this, their approach to medicine was an incredible, highly effective blend of practical herbalism, advanced surgical skill, and deep spiritual ritual. We often fall into the trap of thinking that ancient medicine was entirely primitive, just a collection of superstitions and guesswork. But high in the Andes, Incan surgeons were performing procedures that would make European doctors of the same era, and even centuries later, absolutely marvel. One of their most astonishing practices was a procedure known as trepanation. This involved literally scraping or cutting a small hole into the skull of a living patient. Now, I know that sounds terrifying, especially when you are trying to relax. But the reality of why and how they did this is a beautiful testament to their desire to heal and preserve life. In a sprawling empire, built and defended largely through hand-to-hand combat and the use of the huaraca, a traditional woven sling that could hurl heavy stones with devastating force, severe head trauma was incredibly common. When a warrior or a builder suffered a fractured skull, the Incan healers understood that the pressure building up inside the head from the swelling could be fatal. To relieve this pressure, they would carefully surgically remove a piece of the fractured bone. They performed these delicate surgeries using razor-sharp blades crafted from black volcanic obsidian, or precise scrapers made of an alloy of copper and bronze. What I find most incredible, what truly stops me in my tracks when I reflect on this historical fact, is their survival rate. Modern archaeological studies of these ancient altered skulls show that up to 80 or even 90% of the patients survived these complex surgeries, their bone completely healing and growing back smoothly over the years. To put that astounding success into perspective, during the American Civil War, occurring hundreds of years later, with metal tools and supposedly modern knowledge, the survival rate for similar head surgeries was terrifyingly low. The Inca achieved this ancient medical miracle through a deep, intimate understanding of human anatomy, and crucial to their success, their brilliant use of natural antiseptics. The surgeons did not work alone. They were often accompanied by wandering master herbalists known as the Kalawaya. Imagine a Kalawaya arriving in a remote village, wearing a brilliantly woven, heavy poncho, carrying a large, brightly colored woven bag across his chest known as a chuspa. As he opens the bag, the room fills with the sharp, earthy, and medicinal scents of the jungle and the high peaks. Inside that bag was a portable, highly effective pharmacy. They carried balsam resin to pack into wounds to prevent infection. They carried the bark of the cinchona tree, which is rich in natural quinine, a miraculous cure for the deadly fevers and muscle aches of malaria. Long before modern science could synthesize these compounds in a sterile laboratory, these wandering healers were carefully peeling the bark from trees in the cloud forest to bring down a burning fever. And, of course, resting securely in the Kalawaya's bag was the ever-present, highly sacred leaf of the coca plant. During these intense surgeries, the patient was given large amounts of chicha, the fermented corn beer, along with concentrated doses of coca leaves to chew. The coca acted as a mild, natural anesthetic, numbing the pain and keeping the patient remarkably calm while the surgeon worked with intense focus. But the coca leaf was so much more than just a medical tool. It was a daily comfort, a warm companion against the biting wind. When chewed slowly, it acts as a mild stimulant, gently suppressing hunger, alleviating the crushing fatigue of the extreme altitude, and warming the blood. It was a precious gift from the earth, grown in the warm, humid valleys, and carried up to the freezing peaks to make life there not just survivable, but comfortable. This beautiful balancing act, using the warmth of the valley to heal the cold of the mountain, speaks to a much larger Incan philosophy, a concept they called tincui. Tincui is a Quechua word that describes the sacred, powerful intersection of two opposing but complementary forces. It is the exact moment and place where two rushing rivers meet in a valley to form a single, more powerful stream. It is the blending of night and day at dawn, the meeting of the hot sun and the cold stone. The Inca believed that the entire universe was held together by these intersections, that true harmony and health could only be found when opposing forces were brought into a respectful, balanced relationship. It is a wonderfully peaceful thought to wrap your mind around as the day finally ends. You do not have to fight the contrasting forces in your life. You simply have to find their tincui, their point of balance. Just as the ancient healers blended the sharp cut of obsidian with the soothing, numbing juice of the green leaf, our own lives are a constant, gentle weaving of effort and rest, of light and shadow, merging together in the quiet dark. This beautiful concept of tincui, of bringing all things into perfect, harmonious balance, was not just a medical or spiritual idea. It was the very blueprint for the entire Incan world. You see, the Inca did not actually call their empire the Incan Empire. That is a name given to them much later by outsiders. They called their vast, sprawling realm Tawantinsuyu. In the soft, flowing syllables of the Quechua language, this translates to the realm of the four quarters, or the four parts bound together. Imagine a massive, sprawling compass laid across the jagged spine of South America. The empire was divided into four distinct regions, each with its own unique climate, culture, and resources. There was Chinchaysuyu to the north, stretching up into the warm, fertile coasts and valleys. Kulasuyu to the south, encompassing the freezing, high-altitude plains of the Altiplano, where the great herds of llamas roamed. Tawantinsuyu to the east, dropping down into the dense, humid, and mysterious Amazon jungle, and Constellations to the west, sloping down toward the crashing, salty waves of the Pacific Ocean. And right in the very center of this massive geographical compass, acting as the spiritual and political anchor for millions of people, was the city of Cusco. They considered Cusco to be the navel of the world, the exact point where all the vibrant threads of the four quarters met, tangled, and were tied perfectly together in a grand cosmic tinkui. I find it deeply fascinating to think about how they managed to keep these four incredibly diverse, often stubborn regions completely unified without the use of physical money. In Tawantinsuyu, there were no gold coins, no silver pieces changing hands in a busy market. The currency of the realm was human energy. They utilized a brilliant, highly organized system of collective labor known as the mitar. Every single citizen, from the strongest young builder to the oldest grandmother, weaving quietly by the fire, owed a specific amount of their time and skill to the state each year. Instead of paying taxes with objects, you paid with your hands. If you were a master stonemason, you might spend a few months a year carving blocks for a new sun temple. If you were a skilled weaver, you crafted the fine tunics worn by the nobility. If you were a farmer, you helped cultivate the vast state-owned terraces to fill the kolkas, those massive stone storehouses we visited earlier. In return for this labor, the state provided absolutely everything you needed to survive. They provided the raw materials, the food, the festivals, and the deep, unshakable security of knowing you would never be abandoned. When I reflect on the mitar, it strikes me not as a burden, but as a massive, synchronized heartbeat. Millions of people waking up each day in the thin mountain air, contributing their small, steady rhythm to the survival of the whole. And it was this collective, tireless heartbeat that allowed them to achieve architectural feats that still baffle modern engineers today. Let us journey just a bit further down the sacred valley, away from the quiet mists of Machu Picchu, to the staggering, monumental fortress of Ollantaytambo. As you approach this site, the sheer scale of it makes you feel incredibly small. The mountain face has been carved into massive, towering agricultural terraces, but it is the unfinished Temple of the Sun at the very peak that truly steals the breath from your lungs. The temple is constructed from enormous blocks of pink granite, a type of stone known as porphyry. Now, here is the beautifully astonishing part. The quarry where they cut these massive pink stones is located high on a completely different mountain, on the opposite side of the rushing, treacherous Urubamba River. Some of these individual stone blocks weigh over 50 tons. That is the weight of several modern school buses, carved entirely by hand with harder river stones and bronze tools, without a single wheel or iron chisel in sight. How did they possibly move these mountains of pink granite down a steep slope, across a violent river, and then drag them hundreds of feet up another sheer cliff? The answer lies in their absolute, unwavering patience and their willingness to literally reshape the earth to suit their needs. The Incan engineers did not try to fight the running river. Instead, they patiently gathered thousands of workers, operating under the Mita system, and they temporarily diverted the entire Urubamba River into a new artificial channel. They forced the roaring water aside, exposing the dry, rocky riverbed. Then, using massive ropes woven from leather and grass, thousands of men slowly, agonizingly, dragged the 50-ton pink stones across the dry valley floor. Once the stones were safely across, they simply removed their earthen dams and allowed the river to flow gently back into its ancient, natural path. It is almost impossible to comprehend the level of coordination, the sheer physical exertion, and the immense quiet patience required for just one of those stones. When you look at the pink granite walls of Ollantaytambo today, you are not just looking at a building. You are looking at frozen human willpower. You are seeing the physical manifestation of thousands of people working together in perfect harmony, moving mountains across rivers, all driven by that slow, steady, shared heartbeat of the empire. As you settle deeper into your pillows, let the image of that slow, monumental effort remind you that great things are never built in a rush. They are built stone by stone, day by day, with patience, breath, and quiet determination. That quiet determination, however, was beautifully balanced by moments of immense, vibrant celebration. The heartbeat of the Mita labor system did not just build walls. It also fueled a calendar, filled with profound joy, music, and reverence. In Tawantinsuyu, work and worship were not separate things. They were the same breath drawn in, and the same breath let out. I want you to imagine the soundscape of this ancient mountain world. The Inca did not have stringed instruments like guitars or violins. Instead, their music was born entirely from wind and rhythm, mirroring the howling gales and the steady footfalls of the Andes. The most beloved instrument was the quena, a simple, incredibly evocative flute carved from hollow bamboo or, sometimes, from the pale bone of a condor or a llama. The music they played on these flutes was based on a pentatonic scale, utilizing only 5 notes. This creates a haunting, open, and deeply melancholic sound that seems to perfectly capture the vast, lonely expanse of the high-altitude plains. Picture a solitary Incan shepherd wrapped tightly in a thick, naturally dyed wool poncho, sitting on a rocky outcropping as the sun dips below the jagged horizon. The sky is turning a deep, bruised violet. His herd of llamas is settling down for the night in the freezing mountain grass. He raises a beautifully carved bone quena to his lips and breathes into it. The melody that floats out over the empty valley is slow, mournful, and incredibly peaceful. It is a sound that does not try to fill the silence, but simply dances with it. When I listen to traditional Andean flute music today, I always feel an immediate sense of grounding. It is music that refuses to be rushed. It forces you to slow your own breathing, to match its deliberate, airy pace, making it the perfect lullaby for a restless mind. But the music of the Inca could also be overwhelmingly powerful and grand. As the year slowly turned toward the winter solstice in late June, the coldest and darkest time of the year, in the southern hemisphere, the entire empire turned its eyes toward Cusco for the Inti Raymi, the great festival of the sun. This was the most sacred event in the Incan calendar. Hundreds of thousands of people from all 4 quarters of the empire would make the exhausting pilgrimage to the capital, their colorful regional textiles flooding the city like a river of crushed flowers. For 3 full days before the solstice, the entire city of Cusco underwent a strict, solemn fast. No fires were allowed to be lit anywhere in the city. No physical intimacy was permitted. The people ate only raw, unseasoned white maize and simple herbs. They were actively participating in the quiet, freezing darkness of the earth, waiting patiently for the return of the light. I find it deeply moving how they physically synchronized their bodies, with the deprivation of winter making the eventual return of the sun feel so much more miraculous and earned. On the morning of the solstice, long before the first hint of dawn, the Sapa Inca, the great emperor himself, would walk barefoot into the center of the Huaycaypata, the massive main plaza of Cusco. He was followed in absolute silence by his Panica, the royal family, and the highest priests of the realm. They stood in the freezing, pitch-black mountain air, thousands of people holding their breath, looking east over the jagged silhouette of the mountains. Imagine the intense, shivering anticipation. It is the exact feeling of lying awake, in the dark, waiting for the first soft grey light of morning to touch your window, trusting that the sun has not forgotten you. And then, the very moment the first blinding ray of golden light breached the highest peak, the silence was shattered. From the high walls of the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman above the city, priests blew into massive pututus. A pututu is a large, spiraling conch shell. It is a fascinating historical irony that in a city located over 11,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by endless peaks of granite and ice, the most sacred sound of their grandest festival was the deep, roaring bellow of the distant ocean, the sound of dozens of conch shells echoing down into the valley is a primal, vibrating drone that you feel in your chest just as much as you hear in your ears. As the sun bathed the plaza in immediate, radiant warmth, the Sapa Inca would raise 2 massive, perfectly identical golden cups, called keros, high into the light. Both were filled to the brim with sweet, fermented chicha. With his right hand, he offered the golden cup to Inti, the sun god, slowly pouring the liquid into a carved stone channel in the plaza that flowed directly down into the sacred, gold-lined walls of the Coricancha temple. With his left hand, he drank from the second cup, and then passed it to his royal family, formally sharing a drink with the universe itself. It was a moment of profound cosmic relief. The sun had returned. The darkness had broken. Following this quiet, sacred offering, the fasting was immediately broken and the city erupted into 9 days of continuous, ecstatic celebration. Massive fires were lit using a parabolic golden mirror to catch the sun's rays, symbolizing a fresh, pure start to the year. But amidst all this celebration of the sky, they never forgot the ground beneath their feet. Throughout the festival, they made constant offerings to Pachamama, the great Mother Earth. They understood that Inti provided the light and warmth, but it was Pachamama who held the seeds, who provided the soil, and who ultimately fed their children. To honor her, they would gently bury small, precious items in the dark soil. A handful of perfect green coca leaves, a beautifully carved miniature silver llama, or a perfectly round seashell. It was a physical gesture of reciprocity, returning a small piece of beauty to the earth that gave them everything. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, imagine the soft, rich smell of that newly turned mountain earth, and the peaceful feeling of letting go of your own offerings to the day, burying your worries in the quiet dark, and trusting the ground to hold them for you until morning. This beautiful, quiet trust in the earth, this intimate relationship with Pachamama, was not just about the soil directly beneath their sandals. It extended deeply into the dark spaces below the ground and soared high into the thin, freezing air above the peaks. To understand the Incan mind, we must look at how they conceptually divided the entire universe. They did not see the world as a single flat stage. Instead, they envisioned it as three distinct, interconnected realms of existence, a cosmic architecture that is just as breathtaking as their mortarless stone walls. These three worlds were represented by a powerful geometric symbol known as the chacana, or the Andean cross. You can still see this symbol beautifully carved into the ancient stones of their temples. It looks like a stepped cross with a perfectly round hole in the exact center, representing the ultimate, unifying center of Cusco. The chacana was not just a decoration, it was a map of the universe. The lowest realm was Uku Pacha, the inner world, the world beneath the earth. This was not a place of punishment or fire like some Western concepts of the underworld. Instead, Uku Pacha was a place of immense, quiet gestation. It was the realm of the ancestors who had been laid to rest in the dark soil, the realm of the unsprouted seeds, waiting patiently for the spring rain, and the hidden, winding pathways of underground rivers. It was the womb of the earth, holding the potential for all future life in a deep, peaceful slumber. The animal that represented this hidden world was the serpent, or Amaru. The serpent makes perfect sense when you think about it. It lives close to the dirt, it slithers into dark, unseen crevices, and beautifully, it periodically sheds its old, dead skin to emerge fresh and renewed. For the Inca, the serpent was a literal embodiment of regeneration, a quiet reminder that what appears to be dead is often just preparing for a new beginning. When I sit here with you, talking about these ancient beliefs, I often think about the nature of storytelling itself. It is so easy for history to become repetitive, just cold facts, endlessly recited, running the risk of feeling like reused, hollow content that merely echoes what 1,000 others have already said on the internet. But to truly avoid that, to create something deeply original and alive that resonates with a real human heartbeat, we must pause to actually feel the texture of their world. We must try to understand the profound emotional comfort they found in watching a snake slide into the roots of a tree, seeing not a monster but a sacred promise of rebirth. Rising above the dark soil brings us to K Pacha, the middle world. This is the realm of the present, the physical world where humans, plants, and animals live, struggle, and thrive right now. This is the world of the stinging mountain wind, the warmth of the sun on your skin, and the taste of sweet maize. And as we discussed earlier, the supreme guardian of this middle, waking world was the puma. The puma represents ultimate physical strength, cunning, and the raw, unpredictable power of nature that humans must respect and navigate every single day. But if we cast our eyes upward, past the highest, snow-dusted peaks, we enter Hanan Pacha, the upper world. This was the sacred domain of Inti, the sun, Mama Killa, the moon, and the sprawling, glittering river of the stars. It was the realm of pure spirit and divine energy. And the undisputed king of this upper sky, the physical messenger between the heavens and the earth, was the Andean condor. I want you to try and visualize the absolute, staggering size of this bird. The Andean condor is one of the largest flying birds on the planet. Its wingspan can stretch over 10 feet across. When a condor takes to the air, it does not frantically flap its wings like a smaller bird. That would require far too much energy in the oxygen-starved altitudes of the Andes. Instead, it relies on supreme, effortless patience. It waits on the edge of a high cliff for the invisible, powerful thermal currents of warm air to rise from the valleys below. And when it catches that current, it simply steps off the edge and spreads those massive, dark wings. It rides the wind with absolute stillness, soaring in massive, silent circles for hours without a single flap, climbing higher and higher until it is nothing but a dark, unmoving speck against the blinding blue sky. For the Inca people, working the steep terraces below, the shadow of a condor, sweeping silently over the green fields, was not just a passing bird. It was a direct, physical connection to the gods. It was believed that upon death, a person's spirit would be gently carried up into Hanan Pacha on the broad, silent wings of a condor. There is something incredibly soothing about that imagery. The thought of leaving the heavy, physical burdens of K Pacha behind and being lifted effortlessly into the thin, bright air, carried by something ancient and majestic. It is a beautiful way to think about letting go. As you rest quietly now, you can imagine releasing your own heavy thoughts, letting them catch an invisible current of air and watching them drift silently away over the high mountains, leaving you completely tethered, safe, and peaceful in the quiet dark. As we let those heavy thoughts drift away into the high, cold air, carried far over the peaks, let us gently bring our focus back down to the warm, breathing reality of the people themselves. When we strip away the massive stone monuments and the glittering golden gardens, what remains is the simple, quiet rhythm of daily life. I find it deeply comforting to examine how ancient people understood and moved through their days. It grounds history, taking it out of the grand, sweeping timelines of conquests and placing it right into the calloused hands of an ordinary person sitting by a fire. In Tawantinsuyu, the concept of time was radically different from our own rigid, ticking clocks. They did not slice their days into highly stressed, panicked minutes and seconds. Instead, time was fluid, measured entirely by the natural rhythms of the earth and the steady pace of human tasks. For example, if you were to ask an Incan farmer how long it might take to walk to the next village, or how long a particular chore should last, they might reply that it would take the time of a papa pat timpu. This beautifully translates to the time it takes to boil a potato. Imagine that for a moment. You are not rushing against a mechanical ticking hand on a watch face. You are pacing your life alongside the gentle, bubbling sound of water in a clay pot, waiting patiently for the heat of the fire to soften a vegetable plucked straight from the dark soil. It is an incredibly forgiving, deeply human way to measure existence. The entire empire operated on this localized, physical understanding of time. It forces you to be entirely present in the moment, to watch the fire, to listen to the water, to smell the earthy steam rising into the cold air. When I reflect on how frantic our modern world has become, always rushing to the next appointment, I realize that sharing these specific, quiet historical details is exactly how we breathe real life into a story. It is not just about avoiding the repetition of facts. It is about finding the shared, restful human experience that still resonates with us today. This patient, deliberate pacing extended deeply into how they raised and educated their children. In the heart of Cusco, hidden behind towering, perfectly fitted stone walls, stood the Yache Wasi, which translates to the House of Knowledge. This was the academy for the young nobility, the future administrators, priests, and engineers of the empire. But remember, this was a civilization entirely without the written word. There were no heavy, dusty books to read in the quiet light of the afternoon. There were no slates to write on. Education here was an exercise in intense, sustained listening and massive feats of memory. The teachers in the Yache Wasi were highly respected wise men known as the Amautas. Imagine a courtyard paved with smooth grey stones, warmed by the intense midday Andean sun. A group of young boys, wrapped in soft, vibrant tunics, sit in an absolute, respectful circle around an elder Amauta. The Amauta does not lecture from a page. He recites from the vast, echoing library of his own mind. He teaches them the complex geometry required to build a suspension bridge, the subtle astronomical movements needed to predict the solstice, and the sprawling, intricate genealogies of the emperors, all entirely through spoken poetry and rhythmic chanting. To assist in this staggering mental effort, they, of course, used the Quipu, the knotted strings we marveled at earlier. But the Quipu was just the physical anchor. The true repository of knowledge was the human brain itself. The students spent 4 grueling years simply learning how to listen, how to retain, and how to accurately pass the breath of their ancestors forward without altering a single syllable. It is a stunning testament to the capacity of the human mind. When it is stripped of external distractions, we rely so heavily on our digital devices to remember everything for us, from phone numbers to the directions to our own homes. The Inca had to hold their entire universe inside their heads. For the vast majority of the population outside the noble houses of Cusco, education was entirely practical and profoundly intimate. A young girl learning to weave did not go to a school. She sat closely beside her mother or grandmother in the dim, warm light of their stone home. She watched the older woman's hands, moving with a practiced, fluid grace, passing the brightly dyed woolen threads back and forth across the simple wooden backstrap loom. She learned by mirroring, by feeling the tension of the yarn, by understanding exactly how much pressure to apply to create the complex geometric tokapu patterns. It was an education of pure physical presence. A young boy learning to farm would follow his father up the steep, dizzying agricultural terraces. He would learn the exact, dense smell of the soil when it was ready for the potato seed. He would learn to read the subtle changes in the direction of the freezing mountain wind that warned of an approaching frost. He would learn exactly how to strike the hard earth with the heavy wooden digging stick without exhausting his lungs in the thin air. Their classroom was the mountainside itself. The curriculum was survival, deeply intertwined with absolute respect for the elements. As you lie there in the quiet dark, let your own mind mirror the deep, unhurried peace of the Tawantinsuyu. Let go of the rigid hours and minutes that defined your day. You do not need to rush towards sleep. It is not a deadline. Just like a slow, patient lesson in the Yache Wasi, simply listen to the steady, rhythmic breathing of your own body. Let the heavy, frantic thoughts of the modern world dissolve, and allow the quiet, ancient patience of the mountains to fill the empty space they leave behind, tethering you gently and safely to the present moment. This quiet tethering, this deep, shared understanding of how to exist in the world, was bound together across thousands of miles, not just by paved roads, but by a single, flowing language. When the Inca expanded their borders, absorbing hundreds of distinct tribes and chiefdoms into Tawantinsuyu, they understood that true unity could never be achieved through force alone. You can conquer a village with weapons, but you can only conquer a heart with communication. To achieve this, they established a beautiful, unifying tongue that they called Runasimi, which translates quite simply and perfectly to the speech of the people. Today, we know it as Quechua. Quechua is a deeply fascinating, onomatopoeic language, meaning that many of its words were born directly from the natural sounds of the Andean environment. The word for wind sounds like the rushing air pushing through the high mountain grass. The word for a river mimics the bubbling, churning water over smooth stones. When people spoke to one another, in the plazas or across the terraced fields, they were quite literally echoing the sounds of the living earth, back and forth. I find it so beautiful to imagine a language that does not separate humans from nature, but acts as a constant vocal reminder that we are just another sound in the grand, noisy chorus of the world. To spread this language across an empire that stretched over 3,000 miles, the Inca employed a sweeping, highly organized system of social engineering known as the Mitmakuna. Instead of forcing a newly conquered province to immediately change their entire way of life under the threat of violence, the emperor would gently but firmly relocate thousands of entirely loyal, Quechua-speaking families from the heartland of Cusco directly into the newly integrated territory. These loyal families were given prime agricultural land, massive herds of llamas, and fine textiles. They were not sent as brutal occupying guards, but as living, breathing examples of the Incan ideal. They taught the newly absorbed people how to build the superior stone terraces, how to organize their labor for the Mita, and most importantly, they spoke Runasimi in the markets and at the wells. It was a brilliant, slow-moving tide of cultural assimilation. Over a single generation, the children of the conquered tribes would naturally grow up playing with the children of the Mitmakuna, effortlessly adopting the language, the customs, and the quiet, rhythmic pacing of the empire. And at the very core of this shared culture was a moral code so profoundly simple that it governed millions of people without the need for written laws, judges, or massive overflowing prisons. The entire legal foundation of the Incan world rested on just three absolute maxims: Amasua, Amalula, Amaquela, do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. It strikes me how completely these three simple rules cover the absolute necessities of a functioning, harmonious society, because everyone was guaranteed food, clothing, and shelter by the state. In exchange for their labor, theft was incredibly rare. There was simply no desperate need to take what belonged to another. Because of this, the Inca did not have locks on their doors. They did not have heavy iron keys or barred windows. If an Incan family was leaving their stone house for the day to work in the fields or visit a neighboring village, they would simply take a small, lightweight wooden stick and lean it horizontally across the open doorway. That fragile piece of wood was the only security they needed. It was a universally understood sign that the house was empty. And in Tawantinsuyu, an empty house was an absolute sanctuary that no one would dare violate. When I reflect on the heavy metal deadlocks and the glaring security cameras that dot our modern neighborhoods, the image of that single, quiet wooden stick resting safely across a doorway feels like a glimpse into a peaceful, forgotten paradise. It represents a society built upon an unshakable foundation of absolute mutual trust. This deep sense of community and trust was celebrated in deeply intimate ways, particularly when welcoming new life into the world. In the Incan Empire, a child was not officially considered a full member of the community until they had survived the incredibly fragile first 2 years of life in the harsh, freezing altitudes. When a child reached this milestone, the entire village would gather for a joyous, beautiful ceremony known as the Rutuchikui, or the hair-cutting ceremony. Imagine a warm, sunny afternoon in a high-altitude courtyard. The young child, who has never had their hair cut since the day they were born, is seated in the center of the gathering, wearing a beautifully woven, miniature tunic. The eldest and most respected member of the family, often a grandfather, with deeply weathered, kind eyes, approaches the child, holding a sharp, polished blade made of bronze or obsidian. With immense care and tenderness, he cuts the very first lock of the child's soft, dark hair. As he does this, he formally bestows upon the child their true name, a name that will carry them through the rest of their lives, often reflecting a quality of nature or an animal spirit. Then, one by one, every single member of the extended family and the village approaches the child. They each gently cut a small lock of hair, and in exchange, they offer the child a gift. It might be a fine piece of Vicuña wool, a perfectly carved wooden cup, or the promise of a strong, healthy llama from their herd. It is a stunningly beautiful psychological transition. Through this simple act, the child is no longer just a vulnerable infant, belonging only to their mother and father. They are now woven directly into the massive, supportive fabric of the entire village. They are recognized, named, and financially endowed by their neighbors. It guaranteed that no matter what happened to the parents, that child would always have a massive, extended family watching over them, ensuring they never walked the steep mountain paths alone. This brilliant strategy of bringing people together, of weaving separate threads into a single unbreakable tapestry, extended even to how the Inca handled the spiritual beliefs of the people they conquered. When the armies of Cusco expanded into a new region, they did not smash the idols of the local tribes. They did not burn their sacred shrines or demand that they abandon their ancient gods. The Inca understood that to destroy a people's deeply held spiritual beliefs was to breed eternal, bitter resentment. Instead, they did something utterly unique and politically masterful. They respectfully gathered the most powerful sacred idols, the huacas, of the newly conquered tribe, and they carried them with immense honor and pomp all the way back to the capital city of Cusco. There, these idols were not locked in a dark dungeon. They were placed in beautiful, highly respected shrines surrounding the great sun temple of the Coricancha. The Inca even paid for the original, local priests of those tribes to travel to Cusco and continue tending to their specific gods, offering them chicha and coca leaves exactly as they always had. On the surface, it was a massive display of religious tolerance and inclusion. The conquered people could travel to the glorious capital and see their own gods resting comfortably, right next to Inti, the great sun god. But just beneath the surface, it was a brilliant, velvet-wrapped hostage situation. By holding the sacred, spiritual hearts of the conquered provinces directly inside Cusco, the emperor guaranteed that no distant region would ever dare stage a rebellion. To attack the capital would be to attack the resting place of their own most beloved deities. It was peace maintained not by the sharp edge of a bronze spear, but by the careful, deliberate arrangement of belief. They wove the entire universe, with all its varying gods and different languages, securely to the hitching post of the capital. As you rest now in the quiet comfort of your room, allow yourself to feel that same sense of being safely anchored. You do not need to fight the different thoughts or anxieties that arise in your mind. Simply observe them. Bring them into the quiet center of your breathing and let them rest there safely until they lose their power, dissolving into the peaceful, unbroken silence of the night. That profound, unbroken silence of the night, the deep trust resting gently on a fragile wooden stick, was not an accident. It was a peace, carefully cultivated and fiercely protected by an incredibly organized society. When we think of vast, ancient empires expanding across continents, our minds naturally drift toward images of relentless, chaotic warfare, of burning villages and endless destruction. But the Incan approach to expansion was strikingly different, deeply rooted in their core philosophy of balance and integration, rather than sheer annihilation. I find their method of statecraft utterly fascinating. because it required a level of psychological restraint and patience that was exceedingly rare in the ancient world. The Sapa Inca did not want to destroy a neighboring kingdom. To destroy a kingdom was to destroy its farms, its storehouses, and its labor force. It was a waste of perfectly good human energy. So, before a single bronze weapon was ever drawn, the empire would deploy its most formidable weapon: overwhelming, undeniable diplomacy. Imagine a local chieftain ruling a small but prosperous green valley just outside the current borders of Tawantinsuyu. One crisp morning, he looks up to see a procession descending the mountain path. It is not an army of warriors, but a small, highly decorated delegation from Cusco. They approach his village in absolute peace, carrying with them gifts of staggering, unimaginable luxury. They unroll bundles of the absolute finest Vicuña wool textiles, garments so densely and perfectly woven they practically glow in the sunlight. They present solid golden Cairo cups, heavy and cold to the touch, and they offer herds of pure white alpacas. The message delivered alongside these lavish gifts was simple and softly spoken. The Sapa Inca offered his protection, access to the incredible wealth of the massive stone storehouses, and the beautiful paved roads that connected the world. In exchange, the chieftain only had to pledge his loyalty, dedicate a portion of his land to Inti, the sun god, and agree to the labor tax of the mitta. When I reflect on this strategy, it is a brilliant masterclass in human psychology. They were offering an open, generous hand, filled with absolute security. It was an invitation to join a golden age, an invitation that was incredibly difficult for a small, isolated chief to refuse, especially when he knew exactly what stood silently behind that open hand. Because, if the chieftain, out of pride or stubbornness, refused the lavish gifts and chose to fight, the open hand would slowly close into an unbreakable fist, and the Incan military was a force unlike anything the South American continent had ever seen. They did not fight as a disorganized, screaming horde. Their power lay in their absolute, terrifying discipline. If diplomacy failed, the Incan army would march. Picture hundreds of thousands of men moving through the high mountain passes. But what is most striking is the sound. There is no chaotic yelling, no disorganized clattering of weapons. They marched in perfectly synchronized, terrifying silence. Entire valleys would fall completely quiet as a river of soldiers poured over the ridges. They were organized into strict decimal units: squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, all commanded by officers whose rank was instantly recognizable by the complex geometric tokapu patterns woven into their brightly colored, checkerboard tunics. Their weapons were deeply tied to the earth and the stone of the Andes. The primary weapon of the foot soldier was the macana. This was a heavy, perfectly balanced wooden club topped with a brutal, star-shaped head crafted from solid stone or heavy bronze. In the hands of a trained Incan warrior, a copper star mace could shatter a wooden shield or a bone helmet with a single, devastating strike. They also carried the huaraca, the woven sling. From an incredibly young age, Incan boys practiced with these slings while guarding the llama herds on the lonely, windy slopes. By the time they reached adulthood, they could hurl a smooth, heavy river stone with the terrifying speed and deadly accuracy of a modern bullet, striking targets from astonishing distances. But even on the battlefield, their goal was largely psychological. They wanted to break the enemy's spirit before they had to break their bodies. When the two armies finally faced each other, the terrifying Incan silence would suddenly, violently shatter. Upon a single command, thousands of warriors would unleash a deafening, coordinated roar. They would blow violently into the spiraling marine conch shells, the pututus, creating a deep, vibrating drone that shook the ground. They would beat massive wooden drums covered in puma skin and play piercing, high-pitched notes on bone flutes. It was an overwhelming wall of sound, designed to completely disorient and terrify the opposition, proving the absolute synchronized might of the Sapa Inca. When the dust settled and the territory was inevitably integrated, the emperor would solidify his divine presence by sitting upon the Ushnu. The Ushnu was a highly sacred, terraced stone pyramid platform, built in the very center of the main plaza in every major Incan administrative city. It was the physical and spiritual anchor of the town. Imagine a perfectly constructed, stepped pyramid of smooth, grey polygonal stones, rising above the sprawling, dusty courtyard. The Sapa Inca would ascend the steps of the Ushnu to observe the festivals, review his silent, highly disciplined troops, and preside over justice. When he sat upon this high stone throne, he did not wear a heavy jeweled metal crown like the monarchs of Europe. His absolute symbol of divine power was something far more delicate, yet universally recognized across thousands of miles. It was called the mascapaicha. The mascapaicha was a bright, crimson-red fringe made of the absolute softest wool, meticulously interwoven with brilliant gold threads. Each individual red strand was passed through a tiny, hollow tube of solid gold, creating a shimmering, blood-red curtain that hung gently over the emperor's forehead. I have always found this detail incredibly moving. The fringe hung just low enough to partially obscure his eyes. This was entirely intentional. It made him appear remote, mysterious, and slightly detached from the mundane, everyday world of the people below him. He was not just a man looking at you, he was a living god, viewing the world through a veil of crimson and gold. Because of this divine status, approaching the Sapa Inca was an act of profound, deeply ritualized humility. Even the highest-ranking nobles, men who commanded tens of thousands of warriors, could not simply walk up to the emperor and look him in the face. Before approaching the Ushnu, a noble had to remove his fine leather sandals, feeling the cold stone of the plaza on his bare feet. Then he had to take a small symbolic burden, a wrapped bundle or a heavy stone, and place it upon his own back. He would walk toward the emperor, with his eyes cast completely down, staring only at the intricately paved floor. To look directly into the eyes of the Sapa Inca behind his crimson fringe was considered an unthinkable offense, a dangerous intersection of the mortal and the divine. The most famous and powerful wearer of this red fringe was the 9th emperor, a man whose very name defined the Incan understanding of history itself. His name was Pachacuti. In the soft, flowing syllables of Quechua, Pachacuti translates to something incredibly vast and slightly terrifying. It means he who overturns space and time, or more simply, the earth shaker. And he earned every syllable of that name. It was Pachacuti who took a small, relatively obscure kingdom in the Cusco Valley and transformed it into the colossal, continent-spanning Tawantinsuyu. He was the architect of the great roads, the visionary who designed the Puma-shaped capital, and the mind behind the terraced estate of Machu Picchu. But what is truly fascinating is that the word Pachacuti was not just the name of a great king. It was a deeply ingrained, philosophical concept of how the universe operated. The Inca did not believe that time was a straight, endless line of continuous progress, stretching forever into the future. Instead, they believed time was entirely cyclical, moving in massive, slow circles. Every few centuries, they believed the universe would reach a breaking point, a moment of maximum tension. And then, a Pachacuti would occur. A Pachacuti was a cosmic turning over of the world. It was a massive, spiritual, and physical cataclysm, where the old reality folded in on itself, destroyed by floods, earthquakes, or social upheaval, making way for an entirely new, fresh epoch to begin. The old world had to be turned over, exactly like a farmer, turning over the dark, heavy soil of a terrace to prepare it for a new planting of sweet maize. I find this cyclical view of time so profoundly comforting, especially when the world around us feels chaotic or overwhelming. It is the deep, ancient belief that no disaster is the absolute end of the story, and no golden age lasts forever. It is simply the natural, required breathing of the universe. When we go through our own personal upheavals, our own miniature Pachacutis, a sudden change in our lives, a loss or a difficult transition, it can feel like the world is ending. But in the Incan mind, the earth is just shaking to settle into a better, more stable position. The soil is just turning over so that a new, unexpected seed can finally take root. As you lie there tonight, feeling the soft, comforting weight of your blankets, allow yourself to embrace this slow, cyclical turning. The busy, waking world of your day has run its course, and it is now gently folding in on itself, making way for the quiet, restorative epoch of sleep. You do not need to hold on to the tension of the day. You can let the world turn over. Let the dark, heavy velvet of the Andean night drape softly over your mind, trusting that when the great cycle completes its quiet rotation, the morning will always, faithfully, return to you. But this great turning of the wheel, this inevitable Pachacuti that the Amautas whispered about in the quiet courtyards, was slowly gathering like a dark storm cloud on the distant northern horizon. As we follow the story of this magnificent mountain realm into its final decades, we see an empire that had stretched itself to the absolute, dizzying limits of its geography. Under the rule of the 11th Sapa Inca, a powerful leader named Huayna Capac, Tawantinsuyu expanded all the way from the modern border of Colombia in the north, deep down into the freezing, arid deserts of Chile in the south. It was a logistical miracle that it functioned at all. To send a message from the northern border to the southern tip, a Chasqui runner would have to relay a Quipu across nearly 3,000 miles of some of the most treacherous, lung-crushing terrain on the planet. But there was a hidden internal pressure slowly building within the very foundations of Cusco, driven by a tradition we marveled at earlier, because the mummified emperors, the Malquis, forever retained ownership of their vast estates and the wealth they had accumulated in life. Every single new Sapa Inca who took the throne essentially started with nothing. To build his own royal panaca, to construct his own palaces, and to secure his own agricultural terraces, a new emperor was absolutely forced to expand the borders. He had to conquer new tribes and claim new lands just to establish his own legacy. It was a beautiful, deeply reverent system of ancestor worship. But politically, it acted as a massive, unsustainable engine of eternal expansion. The empire was growing so vast, so incredibly heavy with its own success, that the center was beginning to struggle to hold the four quarters together. I find it a deeply poignant historical reality. The very traditions that made the Incan culture so unique, their devotion to the lingering spirits of the past, were the exact same forces stretching their present reality incredibly thin. And then tragedy struck completely out of the blue, carried not on the wind but in the blood. Long before the Incan people ever saw a Spanish galleon, the invisible vanguard of Europe arrived in the Andes in the form of smallpox. This devastating disease swept down through the continent with terrifying speed, entirely ignoring the great stone fortresses and the suspension bridges. The Incan people had absolutely no natural immunity. It was a silent, invisible Pachacuti. Among the countless thousands who fell ill was the great Emperor Huayna Capac himself, and tragically, his designated heir. Their sudden deaths threw the massive, highly organized empire into absolute chaos. A bitter, brutal civil war erupted between two of his surviving sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, splitting the military and the people completely in half. For years, brother fought brother across the mountain passes, draining the empire's resources and exhausting its invincible armies. Eventually, Atahualpa emerged victorious, capturing his brother and claiming the crimson fringe of the Mascapaicha. But the Tawantinsuyu he inherited was bruised, fractured, and deeply weary. It was at this exact, incredibly vulnerable moment in the vast cycle of time, while Atahualpa was resting his tired army near the northern highland town of Cajamarca, that Francisco Pizarro and a tiny band of 168 Spanish conquistadors marched into the Andes. The collision of these two worlds is one of the most dramatic and deeply misunderstood moments in human history. It was not just a clash of bronze against steel or llamas against armored horses. It was a complete, catastrophic collision of entirely different realities. To the Spanish, gold and silver were the absolute ultimate measures of human value. They were currency, the raw material of global trade, power, and greed. But as we know, to the Inca, gold was simply the sweat of the sun. It was a beautiful, sacred material, meant to reflect light, to honor the gods, and to decorate the earth. It had absolutely no monetary value. When Atahualpa agreed to meet the Spanish, in the plaza of Cajamarca, he arrived in a magnificent, glittering procession, completely unarmed. Believing he was meeting a minor, curious group of foreign diplomats. He could not possibly have comprehended the sheer, desperate hunger for wealth that drove these men in metal armor. In a sudden, chaotic ambush in the enclosed plaza, the Spanish captured the Sapa Inca, cutting down his unarmed attendants, who threw their own bodies in front of the emperor, in a desperate, tragic attempt to protect him. And here, in a small stone building in Cajamarca, we witness one of the most heartbreaking transactions ever recorded. Atahualpa, noticing the obsessive, almost frantic way the Spanish reacted to the gold ornaments of his guards, made a staggering proposition. He stood on his tiptoes in the room where he was being held captive, reached his hand as high as he could on the stone wall, and offered to fill the entire room with solid gold, and then twice over with silver, in exchange for his life and his freedom. The Spanish, completely stunned by the magnitude of the offer, quickly agreed. For months, the silent, highly disciplined Mita labor system of the empire was put to a devastating new purpose. Instead of building terraces, the people were ordered to dismantle the beauty of their world. From all across the four quarters, trains of llamas arrived in Cajamarca, heavily burdened with the absolute finest artistic achievements of a civilization. They brought the life-sized, solid silver llamas. They brought the golden stalks of corn, the intricately hammered sun discs, the delicate, shining birds, and the heavy, sacred Cairo cups. They filled the room, measuring 22 feet long by 17 feet wide, up to a height of over 8 feet. When I try to picture that room, glowing with millions of hours of devoted human craftsmanship, my heart genuinely aches. Because the Spanish did not see art. They did not see the sweat of the sun, they saw only weight. To make the treasure easier to transport back to the ships, the conquistadors ordered massive furnaces to be built. Over the course of several weeks, the breathtaking, irreplaceable artistic heritage of the Incan Empire was brutally melted down into cold, uniform, identical ingots of gold and silver. The beautiful, diverse shapes of the natural world, lovingly crafted by generations of master artisans, were reduced to completely anonymous, heavy bars of currency. It is a profound, tragic loss that the world can never, ever recover. But even more devastating than the loss of the gold was the loss of their voice. When the Spanish priests arrived, they looked at the quipus, the intricate, beautifully colored strings that held the entire history, poetry, and memory of the empire. Unable to read them, and fearing that the knots were instruments of pagan witchcraft or secret rebellion, the Spanish ordered them to be destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of quipus were thrown into massive bonfires. Imagine an entire library, an entire civilization's memory, turning to ash and drifting away on the cold mountain wind. The knowledge of how to read them was violently suppressed, until the Amautas, the wise teachers of the Yache Wasi, slowly died out, taking the beautiful, silent language of the knots into the dark earth with them. Today, only a few hundred quipus survive in museums around the world, completely unreadable, their stories locked forever inside tightly bound threads of cotton and wool. Despite fulfilling the greatest ransom in human history, Atahualpa was tragically executed by his captors. The crimson fringe fell into the dust, and the central structure of Tawantinsuyu collapsed. But the spirit of the people, the deep, enduring resilience they had learned from the earthquakes and the freezing winds, did not simply vanish. The surviving royalty and thousands of loyal followers retreated deep into the plunging, humid valleys of Antisuyu, the Amazon jungle. There, hidden by the impenetrable green canopy and the sheer cliff faces, they established the secret, exiled state of Vilcabamba. For nearly 40 years, they held out against the Spanish, continuing to weave their textiles, speaking the soft, rushing sounds of Quechua, and offering chicha to the earth. They refused to let the heavy, dark soil of the Pachacuti completely cover their reality without a fight. As you settle deeply into your own space tonight, drifting toward the very end of our journey, let their incredible resilience be a quiet comfort. Even when our own worlds feel turned upside down, there is always a hidden, quiet valley inside us, where our true strength remains entirely untouched, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. That storm did eventually pass, but the landscape it left behind was forever changed. Vilcabamba, the final hidden refuge in the clouds, eventually fell to the Spanish in the year 1572. The last Sapa Inca, a man named Tupac Amaru, was captured, and the political entity of Tawantinsuyu was officially, finally extinguished. But empires are not just lines drawn on a map, and they are not just the gold crowns worn by their kings. The true empire was always the people, and the dark, heavy earth they stood upon. And in that sense, the Incan world never truly ended. It simply adapted, folding quietly in on itself during the Pachacuti, and weaving its threads into the new reality just as it had woven together the 4 quarters of the world centuries before. If you walk through the high, narrow stone streets of Cusco today, you will still hear the beautiful, rushing syllables of the Quechua language echoing off the ancient walls. You will see the descendants of the Mitmakuna wearing brightly colored textiles, the deep reds and brilliant blues, still dyed using the exact same natural techniques, passed down from mother to daughter in the warm, dim light of the afternoon. When I look closely at the architecture of the modern city, I am always struck by a profound visual metaphor that perfectly captures this resilience. The Spanish built their grand colonial churches and whitewashed houses directly on top of the ancient Incan foundations. But because the Incan stonemasons originally carved their massive grey blocks to dance gracefully with the earthquakes, their mortarless walls have survived centuries of violent tremors completely intact. Meanwhile, the rigid, unyielding mortar of the colonial buildings above them often cracks, crumbles, and falls during a quake. The foundation, the absolute, solid core of the indigenous culture, remains entirely unbroken, quietly holding up the new world. Out in the vast, sweeping valleys, the ancient agricultural terraces still hug the incredibly steep mountainsides. Their dark, warm soil is still turned by hand, still yielding thousands of beautiful varieties of potatoes. The Quipu grass bridge, The last remaining suspension bridge of its kind is still woven every single year by communal hands over the plunging, roaring gorge, an unbroken 3-day festival of renewal and memory. The towering mountain peaks, the sacred apis, are still quietly revered, and small, respectful offerings of green coca leaves are still left gently on the stone apachitas by weary travelers seeking a safe journey through the high passes. When I reflect on the entire journey we have taken tonight, from the freezing, star-lit peaks to the dense, breathing jungles, what stays with me is not the tragedy of the empire's fall, but the breathtaking beauty of how they chose to live. The Inca taught us that we are deeply, inextricably bound to the natural world. We are not separate from the rushing river, the blazing sun, or the silent, soaring condor. We are all just different notes in the exact same pentatonic melody, echoing together across the vastness of time. As you let go of your final waking thoughts tonight, I hope you can feel that same ancient, grounding sense of connection. You are completely safe, resting in the quiet, comforting center of your own universe. You do not need to carry the weight of tomorrow, just as the stones do not need to carry the weight of the sky. Let the heavy, unbreakable stones of your own inner strength hold you steady in the dark. Let the cool, invisible mountain wind sweep away the lingering dust and anxieties of your day. And as the dark, peaceful river of the Milky Way turns slowly and faithfully above you, may you drift gently into a deep, unbroken, and beautiful sleep. Good night.